What does it take to become a doctor? Of course, there's the years of diligent study, but also a drive to understand what ails people and a passion to heal the wounded. Dr. Jared Bullard exemplifies those traits. Not only is he a pediatric infectious disease expert, but he is driven to inspire the doctors of tomorrow.
So my name is Jared Bullard. I'm one of the physicians who works here in Winnipeg. I am a pediatric infectious disease doctor and section head of that particular program. And I'm also a medical microbiologist. And so I'm associate medical director at CADM Provincial Lab, the public health lab for Manitoba. So a lot of the COVID testing has been done here.
What first attracted you to working in medicine?
If you were to ask my parents, I was interested in medicine from a pretty early age, like about when I was 11. I don't know anything in particular that did it. I certainly think of my grandma was sick around the time, and I remember thinking I wanted to help her, and then revisited that back in high school as well. And it was neat there too, because at that point I was thinking along the lines of psychiatry. I have no idea what particularly or why I would consider that. But then it was once I was in undergraduate Bachelor of Science, it's where I started to do a lot more work in microbiology and parasitology. And I really thought that was the way to go. Just because I found it super intriguing, and I thought that maybe that's what I wanted to end up doing. But then, of course, as you progress and you get into medical school, you start seeing certain aspects of medicine that appeal to you. And again, I found that anything related to infectious diseases and microbiology was, in fact, really appealing. What helped too is that I actually had a year off between medical school and finishing my undergraduate degree. And it was at that point that I started doing some research with the HIV researchers here at the University of Manitoba. And I found, again, that just reinforced. So there was all this reinforcement basically throughout undergrad, the research, and then medical school, which ultimately led me to do the various disciplines that I currently do.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend who's currently studying the sciences and microbiology, and what he tells me, it's pretty intensive stuff sometimes.
It can be. It can be very complicated. And it's interesting now that we're in COVID times that people are using phrases that you would never have expected them to do. And there's a lot of interest just in what we do and how we think. And it's really cool, I'd say.
You know, when you're going through school and you're going through these different elements, like, were you like surprised when you got attracted into microbiology, and what was that like class structure like? Were there times where you feel like you were just hitting your head against the wall?
No, I'd say that, you know what, going through undergrad, I always knew that I liked microbiology, and microbiology is broken up into all sorts of different components. So bacteriology is something that I did a fair amount in my undergraduate days, and parasitology, I loved the course so much that I actually became the lab demonstrator at the University of Winnipeg for both parasitology and bacteriology. I'd say the biggest surprise to me, if anything, was that when I was doing medical school, I knew I wanted to do infectious disease and potentially microbiology as well. But I always was under the impression I would end up being in internal medicine, which deals with adults and older patients. And if you would have asked me my first year if I'd end up going into pediatrics, there's no way that would have happened. But all it took was a rotation in internal medicine as a clerk to make me go, I don't know if this is the right fit. But when I did pediatrics, I saw the light, I think is what some people said. And so that I applied to that program in addition to internal medicine. And in the end, it worked out quite well. I'm very, very happy doing pediatric infectious diseases. And I think more so than I would have been doing internal medicine adult infectious diseases.
Mm-hmm. What was it about just that kind of like rotation that you're like, yeah, this isn't going to work out?
You know, the biggest thing, and I tell trainees who about this experience, was that you're there for about 7 weeks doing a rotation, and you get to know these people, and they're fantastic, and you really enjoy your time with them. And it's almost like you're polishing them up, and you get them to a point where they can go home, and you're all excited. And then toward the end of that 7 weeks, there was a whole bunch of them coming back, and you're just like, what's going on here? And then on top of that, I found that even like a month or two after I finished the rotation, a lot of them were showing up in the obituaries. And I found that not hard, but it was just, you know, it was a lot of work to get people to come to a plan, to make them feel better and get them home. And ultimately, I almost felt it was futile. And not to say that it was, that was just my perception of it, because I know that there's lots of doctors who do internal medicine, including my wife, who love that sort of thing and trying to optimize kind of more of end of life care. When I did pediatrics, it was the opposite. It was as complicated as internal medicine, but once they got home, they stayed home. They didn't come back, and it was really gratifying to see that. And I think that the culture in pediatrics is a bit more of a better fit for me as well. They're a little bit more laid back in some ways, and a bit more fun. Not that, again, other doctors aren't fun, but pediatricians are a special group when it comes down to it.
I went to the University of Manitoba's website, and then there was a link there to all the different studies and like articles that you've worked on. I think it was something like 41 results were in there. Just what is the experience like working on these articles and papers, and which one kind of stands out to you as your just like your favorite, the one that you're most proud of?
Mm-hmm. You know, if you'd have asked me 3-4 years ago if I was a researcher, I probably would have said not really. A lot of what I focused on in doing research was really answering straightforward questions, which I guess is research, but it was more to do with how do we provide better services in terms of testing and screening, and especially around the sexually transmitted bloodborne infections and HIV. So that was kind of what I started. But with COVID, it really came down to being at the right place, right time, with a very specific knowledge and skill set to be able to answer certain questions. So when I think of the research and the papers that have come out, the two that I'm particularly proud of would be one that was in the Clinical Infectious Diseases in May of 2020, predicting SARS coronavirus 2 infectivity from patient samples. And why that one in particular? So this was actually one of the first research studies in the world that defined exactly how long somebody with COVID was infectious. And that's where we discovered that it was probably in that 8 to 10 day range. And why I'm particularly proud of that paper as well is, I mean, the people that I worked with here in Manitoba, it was not just at CADM Lab, it was University of Manitoba people, it was people in public health, it was people over at the National Lab. And we basically defined the way to do the particular studies that we did, looking at this particular virus, linking it to clinical and epidemiological data, and then also defining the cell culture way to do it. And then so when I hear people using the word cycle threshold or CT values, and you can see that it's actually become part of common lingo in and around COVID, it's interesting that I had a contribution to that particular research. The other one that comes to mind that I'm particularly proud of is was in the Canadian Medical Association Journal last year in April. And so that one was following up on the initial study because we wanted to make sure that we included children. As a pediatrician, we know that kids are not always the same as adults, and they have different ways that they interact with the world and the world interacts with them. And we thought that maybe SARS coronavirus 2 was going to be a little bit different. And all we were looking to do was actually just define, well, how long are they infectious? We knew that it was 8 days for adults, but we didn't have any children in that initial study. And so we tried to do that, and we didn't actually manage to achieve that goal. But what we did demonstrate was that children consistently had less virus when compared to adults, and the amount of virus that we could grow, implying that it was live, viable, able to cause infection, was significantly less. And that was really interesting to us, but it also kind of made sense because at this point we were starting to see that clinically children weren't getting as sick. They really, fortunately, don't really seem to be impacted by COVID to the same degree as adults. And then on top of it, they weren't spreading it nearly as well because that's very, very different than influenza, RSV, or any number of different viruses that affect children. They spread it very well. In fact, we look to them to know when we're going to be hit with respiratory virus season. Once we see it in kids, we know that in about 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to see it in the adult population. So I would say that those two in particular were highlights because they were just the impact that they had, and the interest in the general population was also just inspiring, just to say, wow, people are actually interested in science, and I wouldn't have expected that.
for someone who spent like so much time like as a researcher diligently working through these studies and creating these papers, how frustrating must it be when people just come in with like, oh, I know all of this now because of just a quick Google search. I know all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been the past 2 years. Right. And it's to be expected. I think that you can't have something as dominant in society and culture as COVID has been without expecting people to want to learn more about it. And that's great. Again, it's just people being curious and wanting to understand. But yeah, it is a bit frustrating when they start telling me about, in particular, I've actually had people question what my research means, and you're like, well, that's not what it means at all. I mean, I'm pretty comfortable with the interpretations we made, but it's a combination of the lay public certainly has taken my research and their understanding of COVID, and it's not quite accurate. That also applies to some other physicians and practitioners too, right? Like it's being an infectious disease and a medical microbiologist is pretty specialized, and so it's hard, especially for doctors or in other areas, to truly appreciate kind of what's needed to properly interpret those, and that's fair. I mean, we all have patients and everybody's best interest in mind, and I keep that in the back of my head. But yeah, it's been an interesting road, and I love when people throw out phrases and terms, and you're like, wow, this is exciting, and then it's good. I mean, only good can come from having people show more interest in our field of interest.
As a person of color, have you faced any challenges while working within just the medical fields or STEM? Because I've had conversations. What's it called? Of course, I forgot the name right now, but it's Immigrant and International Women in Science. They're a group that works to get particularly immigrant women into the fields that they study, because they're having a hard time finding jobs, or when they do, there's a lot of discrimination in.
You know what? I mean, I'm originally from the Bahamas and I was born there, but moved here when I was fairly young to Winnipeg. What I noticed more than anything, being Black or biracial technically, is that it was very rare to have another Black person in my class or program. Like I can literally think in kindergarten through grade 9, there was one other Black girl. In high school, in the honors program, there was one other Black guy. When I did my Bachelor of Science at the University of Winnipeg, there was one guy in chemistry and me in biochemistry, molecular biology. And then in medical school, there in a cohort of 300 of us, there were literally two Black people, me and a good friend of mine in my wife's year, actually. And that was really interesting. It was just that feeling that, there really wasn't the best representation of Black people in general. And certainly, knowing that I was a 15th graduate from the University of Manitoba's medical school in its entire history was interesting too, right? In terms of the practice of medicine, it's not often that being Black comes up. I would say more than anything, it's related, or more as a person of color, is that people ask where I'm from. And I don't take it personally. I really just kind of think it's interesting, and sometimes I will play with them, and I'll mention, like, I'll joke that, oh, it's my accent, and that's what you're picking up on. And of course, I have a Saint Vital Winnipeg accent, but they go, yeah, it's your accent. I was like, yeah, okay, sure. But a lot of the time, I'm just explaining that, yeah, no, I'm from the Bahamas originally, and it's not just, I would say, white people. It's more common, I'd say, from white parents, grandparents, and patients. But I also get that from a variety of different other people of color. So Indians often think I'm Indian. Filipinos have mistaken me for Filipino.
Interesting.
So you know what? It's just, I think it's just trying to find common ground more often than not. And it's not in an insulting way that I'm asked usually. It is just kind of curiosity, because I think that African patients or Black patients are genuinely interested to know when I tell them I'm from the Bahamas and the West Indies. They think that's great. The other cool thing that I think happens a lot too is that there aren't a lot of Black physicians that children would see. And so again, it's that representation aspect, that having a Black child see a Black physician come into the room, and you can always see that they get very excited about it. They're like, whoa, And I do talk to them all the time, and I ask them what they want to do. And some of them want to be doctors. And it's something that I encourage. I say, you know what, you stay in school and you work really hard, and I'm going to see you when you're here and you're graduating to be a doctor. I'll be right front row for you. And I hope that message sticks. And that's my goal, really.
Well, of course, you want that diversity in the medical field. Like, maybe it can just help someone feel more comfortable if there's someone who looks like them in there, or just the diversity of opinions or thoughts on tackling a certain situation. Everyone has different backgrounds and experiences, so like having that just melting pot of more ideas is only beneficial.
Agreed. I think there's many ways to come at any particular problem, and having that diversity is really important. I mean, certainly as working in a public health lab, I look at all sorts of issues that we have tried traditional methods to address, and it doesn't work. And then you suddenly engage any number of different community grassroots movements from different cultures, and they have these ideas. There's like, well, that's great. That's actually really smart. And then you incorporate it, and you start to see some movement of the needle, and it's actually very reassuring, right? It's great to see that diversity, and that's something, again, that's important. I mean, having that diversity represented in your medical school to reflect the population that you serve is key, and that's one of the goals that I have as a Black physician. In particular, I'm also part of the Black Physicians of Canada as a Central Canada representative, and that's one of the many things that we're advocating and looking to enhance, really, to make sure that we have representation at the various universities across the country.
What do you think are some other ways that we can just help make just medicine and the fields of STEM more inclusive and inviting to diversity?
I think the key is catching people when they're young, right? It's if you can plant that seed in their head that you are good at this and you belong here, just like anybody else, that would go a long way, right? And that's why I make a point of saying that to the patients that I see, and it's not just Black patients, Indigenous patients, Filipino, any of them, really. I will just say, you know what, like this is important, and I think that's the most important message. It's just that you belong here, that science is for you. Like, if you have an ability to think problems through and you like figuring stuff out, you know what? Again, science is a great opportunity to make that happen.
Well, you seem like an awesome guy, and I really hope that, that message is ingrained in these kids, and, maybe in the next couple decades, we're starting to see a much more vast group of people working in medicine. I think it'd be so cool to see like doctors of like all backgrounds just walking around, figuring out solutions, helping patients.
Yeah, and I agree. And right now, even, you know what, I can see the change. I've been in medicine for just over 20 years now, and I think of what it was like when I first started to what it is now, and you can see that diversity happening. Young people in particular, the millennials, we bash on them all the time, but they bring a whole different perspective, and they're very inclusive, and it's really going to be cool to see where we go in the next 20 years.
Awesome. Well, it was great talking with you. Where can people go to find some of those studies that you've worked on?
Boy, you know what? Most of the time, it's a simple one, Google Scholar. If you're to go and put my name, Jared Bullard, into it, you'll find pretty much every study that I've done, and it's usually accessible to most people that way. So that would be my suggestion. Most of the papers and research that I've done will show up there.
Enjoying the content from You Multicultural? Subscribe so you can stay up to date with everything that we're doing. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.